Good luck, everybody. As we've said week after week, Motzei Shabbos is a time for telling stories, particularly of tzaddikim. It brings tremendous bracha. As the world comes to the end of Tov Shin Pei 5780 and we enter into Tov Shin Pei Aleph, which is Tahei Shnas Pelos Arenu, you will see wonders and miracles and unbelievable things. To hear stories of tzaddikim cannot be overestimated. And tonight we're going to learn all about the Alter Rebbe, the founder of Chabad. Rabbi Karlebach is going to take us on a journey on the Alter Rebbe's life. He was born in 1745, but the Alter Rebbe, despite many challenges, went on to revolutionize Yiddishkeit. He was the author of Tanya and Shulchan Aruch HaRav, and he fought Napoleon. His stories are unbelievable. But to tell us more about the Alter Rebbe is none other than the illustrious Rabbi Alex Karlebach. Over to you, Alex.
Thank you, Rabbi Masinta. A good vach to all our listeners. And as you say, tonight is a very special night in discussing the Alter Rebbe, the founder of the Chabad movement, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, and amen to all your brachas for the coming year. You know, the Almighty, one can see Hashgacha Pratis, the divine providence, just in the leaders that he chose for each generation. And none was more suitable than the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the founder of the Chabad movement. Unfortunately, we only have basically an hour for biography and then a short story. And so I don't know that we can truly do him justice in this time, but we will attempt to give over some of this great dynamic leader's greatness. As Rabbi Masinta already mentioned, Rabbi Shneur Zalman was born on the 18th day of Elul, which is also the birthday of the Baal Shem Tov, and also is the birthday of his ancestor, the famous Maharal of Prague, who was also born on the 18th of Elul. He was born in the year 1745 in the city of Lyozhne in White Russia. It was part of Poland at that time. The borders used to change back and forth. His parents are Baruch and Rivka. They had 3 sons, all of whom were outstanding Talmudic scholars and rabbis. The oldest was the Alter Rebbe, Rabbi Shneur Zalman. The second was the famous Maharil, and the third was Rabbi Moshe. The previous Rebbe, by the way, wrote 2 volumes of memoirs all about Baruch's journey in life. Rabbi Shneur Zalman's father was a man of some means. He came from a family that originally lived in Bohemia, and as I mentioned, had son after son a ancestry to the famous Maharal of Prague, Rabbi Yehuda Loi, and Reb Baruch himself was a secret follower of the Baal Shem Tov. In fact, the Baal Shem Tov revealed to his students that a new soul, a neshama chadosha, is going to come down from heaven that is going to illuminate the world in 2 lights, the light of Nigla, the light of the revealed part of the Torah, as well as the esoteric, the Nista, the hidden parts of the Torah. And when the Alter Rebbe was 3 years old, his father took him to the Baal Shem Tov for his upshernish, his traditional haircutting ceremony, and the Baal Shem Tov made a very big tumult about him. This was the only time that Rabbi Shneur Zalman ever saw the Baal Shem Tov, though, as you know, the Baal Shem Tov passed away in 1760, so the Alter Rebbe was 15 years old at the time of the Baal Shem Tov's passing. One would imagine that a chassid like Reb Baruch would bring his son, the Alter Rebbe, to see the Baal Shem Tov many more times, but this was direct orders from the Baal Shem Tov not to bring the Alter Rebbe Rabbi Shneur Zalman to him because he wanted Rabbi Shneur Zalman to come to Hasidus himself. Until the age of 12, young Shneur Zalman studied under a scholar of noble character, a man by the name of Rabbi Yisachar Ber, who lived in Lubavitch, which wasn't far from Liozhno. And then his teacher sent him back home, saying that the boy could continue his studies without the aid of a teacher. And during these early years, when he was in fact only 10 years old, his father, Reb Baruch, had a estate near Liozhna, and he brought refugees from Bohemia to help settle the land. And amongst them was a man by the name of Rabbi Yaakov Tzvi, who had a vast knowledge in science and excelled in mathematics and astronomy. And he saw in this young boy of 10 such amazing brilliance and gifts that he introduced him to the sciences of mathematics and astronomy. A brother of this Yaakov Tzvi, his name was Reb Menachem Elya. He was very, very well versed in Kabbalah, and he had ancient manuscripts from the Arizal. And so, with the help of these two brothers, Shneur Zalman made his first entry into the studies of philosophy of Kabbalah. At 10 years old, I don't know if we realize what an amazing thing this is, Shneur Zalman prepared a calendar for the period of 15 years. And that is from that year until 5530. He noted in that calendar of 15 years, that Jewish calendar, all the tekufos, to know the solstice and the moldus, when the new moons would be, and all the notable days, the dates of Rosh Chodesh and the Yom Tovs. And he even noted down the dates of the fair in Liozhna. Actually, that calendar was in the Alter Rebbe's family for a full century, and it was a cherished heirloom. They noted that it had thick paper, was written in green ink and bound in brown leather. Unfortunately, there was a terrible fire in Lubavitch. Fires broke out many times in those days, and that calendar is only a memory. It was lost. As a matter of fact, as we'll soon see, much of the Alter Rebbe Shulchan Aruch was also burnt in a fire. When Shneur Zalman was only 13 years old at Bar Mitzvah, he delivered his first discourse on the Talmud. And then already he was acclaimed by all the greats of his time who had heard it as an outstanding Talmud Chacham. And he was elected as an honorary member of the local Chevra Kadisha. In those days, that was something indeed, usually for well-respected adults. And he was entered into the Pincus, the register of the community, with many titles and honors, which are only given to mature scholars. The fame of this young Eloi, this young genius in Torah, reached Vitebsk. And there was a very prominent Jew by the name of Yehuda Leib Siegel. He was a man of considerable wealth and scholarship, and he wanted the Alter Rebbe as his son-in-law. Rabbi Shneur Zalman was only 15 years old when he married his wife Sterna, Yehuda Leib's daughter. She proved to be a very worthy wife and stood by him throughout his lifetime. A few examples. He was offered a dowry, and that is enough to support you for 10, 15 years as you devote your life totally to Torah. But he made a condition that he wanted the entire dowry up front, which was fulfilled. This was a vast sum of money. And then he suggested to his wife, and with her approval, he had taken an active interest in the economic position of the Jewish people around him. And the situation was so dire. People were dirt poor. They weren't able, the government around them had made terrible laws. And he felt the towns and the cities were too overcrowded and there was no opportunity to make a living. So he wanted the Jews to settle on land and do agricultural things. So with this dowry, he made a special fund, buying up fortunes of land and helping Jews settle on the land. He gave out all his money for it. And he would deliver talks at the fairs all about that. Rab Shneur Zalman's father-in-law had dealings with the noblemen and high officials around Vitebsk. And on two different occasions, they presented themselves so that the Alter Rebbe, his brilliant son-in-law, would get to know these high officials and their circles. One famous occasion is the sundial of the governor of Vitebsk at that time. The story is that in those days there were no watches, no Rolexes or clocks or anything, and everyone was dependent on a sundial. This governor had a very big sundial in his garden, and it suddenly stopped working for certain hours of the day. It's a long story, but just the punchline is that several scientists who the governor called in failed to solve it. After much persuasion, the young Shneur Zalman was invited to look at it, and his father-in-law had to convince him to go, and he was able to discover that the malfunction was caused by an obstruction created by trees, and he gave exactly the longitude, the latitude, the GPS signals of how far away. He said on this distance, far away, there's a hill on which trees had grown up, and they're blocking the sun at those hours of the day. If you if you cut down those trees, you'll see a sundial will work. The anti-Semites made fun of him and all, but certain people who did believe him went and cut down the trees, and that made an unbelievable impression. There was another time that there was a mathematical problem with which the local Academy of Science had been wrestling for a long time, and it came to the Alter Rebbe, and in minutes he solved it all. And so his reputation and acquaintance with local nobility would later stand him in very good stead. Now, the Alter Rebbe was an ardent student, gifted with a brilliant mind, and he soon became proficient in every aspect of Talmudic literature, all the poskim, everything written till his time before he was 18 years old. And he decided he needed a teacher and a guide to help him attain a higher degree in divine service. He asked around, and from traveling scholars, he heard about the saintly Mezritcher Maggid, Reb Dov Ber, who we discussed last week, who was the disciple and the successor to the Baal Shem Tov. He had also heard of the great Rebbe Eliyahu of Vilna, the Vilna Gaon, and he had those two sides to decide to become a student of the Mezritcher Maggid or of the Vilna Gaon. And he said that in Vilna, he'll learn how to learn better, and in Mezrich, he'll learn how to daven better. And he said to learn, he already knows. To daven, he needs to still learn. It was also said that in Vilna, you will learn how to master the Torah. In Mezrich, you will learn how to let the Torah master you. And Rab Shneur Zalman decided to go to Mezrich, and this would be the turning point in his life. Sadly, Rab Shneur Zalman's father-in-law, Rab Yudaleib Segel, was vehemently opposed to his going to Mezrich. Like many other Jews of that time, they knew very little of what Hasidus was all about and what it stood for. And he was a big misnagid, a bitter opponent to that movement. He told his son-in-law and daughter that if you go to Mezrich, you won't get another cent from us, and all financial assistance will be cut off. Rab Shneur Zalman still wanted to go, and Sterner, his wife, stood by her husband and agreed to his leaving home for 18 months. She sold some of her precious possessions to buy a horse and cart for her husband to make the long trip. Rabbi Shneur Zalman set out for Mezrich together with his brother Rabbi Yehuda Leib. They made their way to Orsha, which was about 50 miles, and suddenly the horse just died. Rabbi Shneur Zalman said there's something suspicious, and he asked his brother, and he found out that his brother had gone without his wife's permission. He told him to go back home, and he would continue to Mezrich on foot. His first impressions of the Maggid were not very encouraging, and nevertheless, he decided to stay. And before long, he realized how saintly and learned Reb Dov Ber the Maggid was, and he became his devoted disciple. He returned to Vitebsk after 18 months, as he had promised his wife. And then Reb Shneur Zalman was met with a great deal of animosity from his wife's family and the members of his community. We are told, for example, one of the famous stories of the time is that the Alter Rebbe had learned in Mezrich how to daven very long. And so Friday night, he was caught up in his davening. He davened extremely long, much longer than the shuls, and even longer than his in-laws' Friday night meal. When he came home, he wanted to make Kiddush, and his father-in-law, who was so opposed to him, had locked everything up. There was no becher, and they couldn't find any wine. All there was a barrel of wine. And we are told that he made Kiddush and he had to drink down most of the barrel, which really affected him. But at the same time, as he had opposition, he also gained a number of followers who were eager to learn about his life. Reb Shneur Zalman didn't suffice with that. He went back to Mezrich and continued to visit his master from time to time. The Mezritcher Maggid had moved to Rovna and also to Annapolis, where he passed away and is buried, and he went there as well. The previous Rebbe writes that the total time the Alter Rebbe spent by the Maggid of Mezrich is based on the words Leiv Chadash, which is a new heart. And Leiv is 32 because he spent a total of 32 months with the Mezritcher Maggid. For several years, Reb Shneur Zalman and his wife suffered many hardships, especially from his in-laws, who were encouraging his wife to divorce him, and that's it. But she stood by his side throughout. And in the year 1767, he was offered the position of Maggid in his hometown, Liozna. And he accepted that post, and he held it for the next 30 years until he moved to Liadi after his second arrest, which we'll still discuss in 1800. To show the brilliance of the Alter Rebbe, when Reb Shneur Zalman was barely 25 years old, Reb Dov Ber had decided that it was time for a new Shulchan Aruch to come out, because the Shulchan Aruch, which is the mainstay of Jewish law for all our nation, was written by Rabbi Yosef Karo over 200 years before that. And he felt that so many new conditions and so many new writings had come out that it's time for a new Shulchan Aruch to be written. And he chose, of all his famous students and great learned teachers, he chose the youngest of his students, Rab Shneur Zalman of Liadi, to write his famous work. Much material had been added to halachic literature, and he had to examine and sift through all the new rabbinic material, making decisions when necessary in light of the earlier codifiers and Talmudic, and finally embody the results in a new edition of the Shulchan Aruch, bringing it up to date. And Reb Shneur Zalman did that unbelievably, superbly. In fact, it gave him an honored place amongst the great codifiers of Jewish law. And the work became known as the Rav's Shulchan Aruch in distinction from its forerunner. And you could see it quoted everywhere. Every group of Jews accepts the Shulchan Aruch Harav. Without going into the details, again, just the punchline, Rabbi Zevin points out that the Alter Rebbe's Shulchan Aruch had three great differences to any other. The first is its organization and clarity. Another is that he included the sources and he gave the explanations of it all. And the third is the analysis of each law, and coming to a clear psak, the arbitration, makes his work certainly very unique. Several years later, he began to work out his Chabad system of Hasidus. As discussed, the Baal Shem Tov introduced Hasidus to the world, and he taught how much God values each and every one of us. He taught that we have to serve God with our heart and serve him with joy, and there must be life to it all. And the Alter Rebbe said that what the Baal Shem Tov was teaching is also that we have to serve God with our heart, but there must be guided by the intellect. As he said, Moyach shalit halalev, the mind has to rule the heart. And so he started the idea called Chabad. Chabad stands for three Hebrew letters. The Ches is Chochmah, wisdom. The base is Bina, understanding. And the Daled is Das, knowledge. And he said that these three, the mind has to rule the heart, and that would totally change the many stories, how that saved lives, in fact. And that became the main premise of his famous work, Tanya, which Rabbi Mesinta printed a few chapters here locally and we strongly urge people, there are many ways you can study Tanya locally and very easily approachable to be able to understand more of what it's all about. On the 19th of Kislev in the year 1772, as discussed, Reb Dov Ber, the Mizritcher Maggid, passed away. He told the Alter Rebbe that this day will be our special Yom Tov. His disciples resolved to continue teaching Chassidus in their respective territories, and Reb Shneur Zalman's task, being that he came from Lithuania, he was to capture the very stronghold of the opposition, the province of Lithuania with the Vilna Gaon. In fact, he was called the Litvak amongst all the Mizritcher Maggid's students. That's very relevant to South Africa, who boasts that so many of its Jews come from Lithuania, are Litvaks. The Alter Rebbe was the Litvak. During the next 3 years, Reb Shneur Zalman visited many important communities where he preached publicly, and he won many, many followers. But it also sharpened the opposition. Reb Shneur Zalman and his senior colleague, Reb Menachem Mendel of Horodok of Vitebsk, went to Vilna in hope of convincing the Gaon that his opposition was based on misinformation and lies. But he would refuse to see them. And that was a big problem. Eventually, Reb Mendel of Vitebsk and Reb Avram of Kalisk, two great Hasidic leaders, decided to leave to Israel. At first, the Alter Rebbe joined them. But on the journey, Reb Mendel Vitebsk turned to the Alter Rebbe and said, no, they need you here in Eastern Europe. Please, you cannot come with us. You have to go back. They went on to Israel, settling in Tzvas and Tiberias. And Reb Shneur Zalman undertook to raise funds for their support, which he did, as we see in the letters of Tanya, begging for support from all the poor people that were his Hasidim and struggled on their own. But he urged them to support the other Hasidim in Israel. Reb Menachem Mendel passed away in 1788 in Tzvas, and at that time Reb Shneur Zalman was recognized as the chief leader of the Hasidim. He established a school of selected disciples in Liozna. Under his leadership and guidance, many well-organized Hasidic communities were established. He was a lover of peace, and he urged his followers to refrain from any debates and quarrels with their opponents, with any of the misnagdim. He introduced many important takonos to improve the standards of prayers and religious observance. He insisted that prayers in the Hasidic shuls should be unhurriedly with devotion. And as discussed last week, the Mizritcher Maggid had already wanted a siddur made work based on the Nusach Hari, and he established, Nusach Hari has many different forms, but he established one from many, many Siddurim called Nusach Chabad, and he also furthered the Mizritcher Maggid on the Chalofim, on the knives, which until then were made with cast iron, but he introduced that it should be with stainless steel. He introduced also that we should have warm mikvahs, thank God. Those two, the knives and the mikvahs, were created such a protest in his lifetime, but as we know, eventually it was accepted by all Jewish people. During those years, 1781 to 1788, Reb Shneur Zalman was busy defending the position of the Hasidic communities. And then for the next 7 years, it was relatively quiet. And he was able to devote his life to his Hasidim. But the partition of Poland took place in 1793, and in 1795, Russia took over large territories of Poland that were deeply populated with Jews. And there were many economic problems at that time, which were worsened by the restrictions placed on the Jews. And Reb Shneur Zalman proved himself to be a very wise scholar and leader, not only of Hasidim, but of Jews in general. And he created a dedicated pattern of leadership as a Hasidic leader, a Rebbe, and a Jewish leader in general. But it began to weigh heavily on him. He had some 100,000 Hasidim at that time, and their numbers were increasing steadily, and they were getting more and more. Everyone was besieging him with his personal problems, material and spiritual. He told them many times, for your material problems, go to your Father in heaven and come to me only with spiritual problems, though they didn't listen. But there were too many people coming to request of him. And so he took basically the problems of the Hasidim that had come to him over the years, and he put all these advice there that he had given them into one classic book, the Book of Tanya. The Book of Tanya was originally written as a guide to spiritual problems. For example, if you ever feel hypocritical of one time feeling religious and another time of temptation, he explains how there's two souls within each person. So in addition to the great Shulchan Aruch, he wrote the Tanya. He also gave many, many discourses, which would be the basis of the Likutei Torah, which is printed, and the Or HaTorah. And the Alter Rebbe, by the way, was also very involved with Nagina, with song. We know that he personally composed 10 melodies. The greatest of them is called the Dalet Bavis, the 4 stanzas, which is called the Alter Rebbe's Nigun. It is only sung in select times, such as weddings and Hasidic holidays after Rosh Hashanah, etc. And these were great innovations of him. Now, in 1798, a group of extremists amongst the opposition, the Misnagdim, Jews, they denounced Reb Shneur Zalman and some of his leading Hasidim to the Russian authorities in Petersburg, which today is Leningrad. It's called St. Petersburg again, as traitors to the Tsar. The false accusation was very well timed because the territory had only recently been annexed from Poland, and Tsar Paul was highly sensitive to any activities. Besides, they said, the Alter Rebbe was supporting the Hasidim in Israel. Israel then was under Turkey, and Russia and Turkey had been at war for years. So they used this as evidence that the Alter Rebbe is the enemy of Russia. On the day after Simchas Torah, in 1798, Reb Shneur Zalman was arrested. He was taken in a black carriage, which is only for counter-revolutionaries. That is, people who get the death sentence, and he was taken to the Peter Paul fortress in Petersburg. Interestingly enough, they know where that is today. There's pictures of his cell, and his life and the future of the whole Hasidic movement hung in the balance. They set up a special commission by the Tsar to investigate the charges, and thank God Reb Shneur Zalman was able to convince his investigators that his movement was only religious, nothing to do with political matters. And as we began telling you, he had many correspondence and contact with other officials in the time, and they convinced the Tsar that those charges were all false. And so 53 days after his arrest, Reb Shneur Zalman was found to be innocent, and there was nothing wrong with the movement, and that is known as Yud Tes Kislev, the day he was released, the same day as the yahrzeit of his teacher, the Maggid of Mezrich, and that became known as Rosh Hashanah of Hasidus. I want to point out, too, there are many stories of what happened to him in jail. Amongst them is the famous story of Ayeko, that God asks each and every one of us, where are you? It's a famous story. I don't have time to go into it right now. And another thing is, of all the Hasidic Rebbes, we have the Alter Rebbe's photograph. How do we have it? There were no cameras in those days. But the Alter Rebbe was sitting in his cell, and one of the artists of the Tsar was so taken by the dignified spiritual face of the Alter Rebbe that he sat by the cell door. There were big keys in those days. And as the Alter Rebbe was sitting in the cell meditating, obviously he wasn't posing for the painting, but the artist had the time to make that painting. And that is how we have that famous painting of the Alter Rebbe, which goes down, is from that time in jail. The news of the Alter Rebbe's release spread quickly and brought great joy to his many followers. Now, the Hasidim could have turned around and really said, we told you and all that. But Reb Shneur Zalman, and we have it in Letters of the Tanya, used the occasion to try again to bring peace and harmony between the opposing camps. And he wrote such letters with humility and love. He appealed to everyone to forget their grievances and win over their opponents through friendliness and brotherly love. The next 2 years saw Reb Shneur Zalman busy counteracting a new danger that threatened Russian Jewry. The Tsar had appointed a famed Russian poet and statesman, Gabriel Derzhavin, as a one-man committee to investigate the Jewish position in Russia and to suggest ways and means to cope with the Jewish problem. He hated Jews, but there were certain Hasidim of the Alter Rebbe who had shown this Derzhavin kindness in his miserable youth, and Derzhavin traveled through White Russia to make investigations. He was in Lyozhne. In October of 1800, he returned to the capital and presented his report, his opinion about the Jews, which was a mixture of truths, half-truths, and falsehoods. And this was decided unfavorable to Jews, advocating a series of new restrictions and pogroms and terrible things. It contained an unfavorable reference to Reb Shneur Zalman, saying that some Jews complained about him, that he took their children away from them and sent them to the gold and silver in Palestine with their gold and silver. And it seemed that while Reb Shneur Zalman was busy trying to ensure that the landed lauded nobility and government officials have good things to say about the Jews, some of the opponents of Hasidim were carrying bad tales to Derzhavin about this Hasidic leader. But as bad as Derzhavin's report was for the Jewish people, it contained at least one favorable view, and that was Prince Lubomirsky, who was a prominent nobleman and an estate owner in White Russia, who was a friend of Reb Shneur Zalman. And several other estate owners of White Russia sent a complaint against this Derzhavin to the Tsar, and as a result, his report was not received, and Baruch Hashem, the position of the Jews was not changed at a time, and this was all due to the Alter Rebbe's influence and getting involved so much about it. In the meantime, the opponents of Reb Shneur Zalman were again busy plotting against him and against the Hasidic movement. False charges were again brought to the authorities in Petersburg, and once again, Reb Shneur Zalman was summoned to the capital to defend himself and his teachings. This time, it wasn't 53 days. It would take over 9 months until Reb Shneur Zalman finally won a complete victory over his slanderers. In the meantime, Tsar Paul was murdered, and the new Tsar, his son Alexander I, ordered the case dismissed. But Reb Shneur Zalman did not go back to Lyozhna. At the invitation of this prince, Lubomirsky, who took such a liking to him, he invited him to come to the city of Liadi, and he would build for him a shul and all these aspects. And it was in Liadi that Reb Shneur Zalman would spend the remainder of his life. And fortunately, it wasn't that long, because he wouldn't end his life in peace. In the year 1812, Napoleon invaded Russia, and the invasion route led through White Russia. Now, this Reb Shneur Zalman, who was imprisoned and threatened of death twice, accused of high treason, he turned out to be a very loyal patriot of Russia, because he said and saw that if the French conqueror would conquer Russia, even though it's true that Napoleon would alleviate the economic position of the Jews and it would improve, but their spiritual position would suffer. And he opposed Napoleon terribly. And he, in fact, urged his Hasidim to do everything they can to support the Russian war effort against the invaders. His followers, many of whom found themselves behind enemy lines, were able to provide very useful intelligence to the Russian generals. And they were very grateful for it, the Russians. In fact, they called him and his descendants a honorable citizen of Russia. Now, there's a famous Hasidic story told that the Alter Rebbe was for Russia to win. And there are different versions as to which Hasidic Rebbe it was that was against him, whether it was the Koznetz and Magid, Rabbi Yisrael of Koznetz, whether it was the Barditchever. You have different stories told of who it was, but there was another Hasidic Rebbe who wanted Napoleon to win. Now we know that everything is decided in heaven. So the heavenly court decided that come Rosh Hashanah, which is coming up now, whichever of those two great Hasidic leaders would blow the shofar first, the one that he wants to win will win. So the other Hasidic leader had his Hasidim stay up night. Already in night, they went to the mikveh the earliest possible moment. They started to daven, and they davened very quickly to finish the service as soon as possible to get up to the shofar first. And he was sure, this Rebbe, that the speed with which he davened, he'll certainly blow the shofar first. When it came, he held the shofar to blow it. He said, the Litvak won. What did the Alter Rebbe do? He did everything as usual on Rosh Hashanah. He served God with everything he had. And before davening, he went and he blew the shofar as soon as you could. It doesn't say anywhere in halacha that you have to daven shachris before the shofar blowing. And so he won, and so his side, Russia, defeated Napoleon. The Alter Rebbe told us or taught that Napoleon had many dangerous aspects to him from Klippa, from the other side of holiness, and he didn't want any of his possessions to get into Napoleon's hands. And when he left his house, in fact, we are told that he forgot some slippers, and he ordered some people to go back to get his slippers, and he burnt down his house upon leaving. We're also told that Napoleon knew of the Alter Rebbe, and so when he came there, the first thing he did was rush towards the house, but he couldn't get any of his possessions. One of the things that Hasidim have till today is Napoleon was an unbelievable general. And amongst the things he taught his soldiers is that you have to go to war alive and with a wonderful march. And that song is called Napoleon's March. And it became a Hasidic song, interestingly enough, until today, after Yom Kippur. I was there present many times at the Rebbe Shul after Yom Kippur. At the conclusion of Yom Kippur, the Rebbe would lead his Hasidim in the Napoleon's March, and you should see this vision. The Rebbe would even stand up on his chair with his kittel and his talis, an indelible impression, and wave on after Yom Kippur. And it was a sign of victory that after Yom Kippur, we have been victorious over all the spiritual, physical opponents, and God has blessed us with a good year, and let us hope that it is this year as well. And when Napoleon was approaching Liadi, the Russian generals provided horses and wagons to evacuate the Alter Rebbe and his family and many followers. It's a long story how they traveled in the middle of the winter. It was, as you know, a very terrible winter. That's partially what destroyed Napoleon's soldiers. And they found themselves on the open roads, suffering hardships and perils. His son, the Mittler Rebbe, had gone on to find lodging, and the Alter Rebbe would tell them at every fork of the road which way to take. The story is told that at one fork, the Alter Rebbe was sleeping, so his grandson made the decision of which way to go, and the Alter Rebbe was very upset. And in a village in the district of Kursk, the Alter Rebbe became very seriously ill, and he passed away at the age of 86. and they brought his body to the city called Hadich in the district of Poltava, and that's where he passed away on the 24th of Tevis. It was Mitzvah Shabbos on a Saturday night of the year 5573 that the Alter Rebbe passed away, leaving his son, the Mizritcher Magid, Reb Dov Ber, the Mittler Rebbe, to become the next Lubavitcher Rebbe. But what the Alter Rebbe had innovated and started, the father of the Hasidic movement in such an amazing way of Chabad Hasidus, which, as we know, still lives on today, and we have so much to be thankful to the Alter Rebbe for. The famous story of the Alter Rebbe in jail was that one of the ministers came in and he asked the Alter Rebbe, "Tell me, can I ask you a question in Chumash?" And he gave his permission. And he said, it says that after Adam and Eve sinned with the tree of knowledge, they hid in the Garden of Eden. And God called out to them and said, Ayeko, where are you? And so this minister says to the Alter Rebbe, I don't understand. Didn't God know where they are? Why did he have to ask them? So the Alter Rebbe gave him Rashi's explanation, which is that God didn't want to frighten them. So he told them, just saying hello. He said, where are you? He said, I know of Rashi's explanation, but I don't accept it. So the Alter Rebbe said, tell me, do you believe that the Torah was written for the benefit of all mankind and applies for all times? And he said, yes, I do. So he said, well, the story of Adam and Eve is a story of each and every one of us. And God is addressing each person. And he said, take you. And he mentioned this person's age. He said, at your age in life, God is addressing you and saying, Ayeko, where are you? I have given you a soul. I have given you a gift of life. I have given you qualities and potentials and strengths of character. Where are you in life to bring this all out and to improve yourself and humanity with everything I have given you? And this was the Alter Rebbe's message to him and to all of us, that every stage in our life, God says, I didn't just give you this to waste your time or to have fun. I have given it to you for the betterment of yourself, your family, your community, and humanity. Where are you in doing all of this? The Alter Rebbe also, the Tsar came to visit the Alter Rebbe, and he was disguised. There were no pictures then. He was disguised, dressed as a common soldier. And the Alter Rebbe stood up for him. And the Tsar was very surprised. He said, how did you know who I was? One of the answer he gave him was that the Malchus Sherakia, the kingdom of heaven and the kingdom on earth, is connected. And so I'm able, from what I know about the kingdom of heaven, I am able to know about how you came. Now I'd like to tell, it's Mitzvah Shabbos, so I'd like to tell you a famous story of the Alter Rebbe, which I think applies. The message is a very important one. There was a small town in White Russia. There lived a very wealthy Jew. Sadly, he was a real miser. That's what the townspeople thought of him, and with good reason. He was often approached to help, and he took out of his purse a rusty copper coin, 5 kopecks, 5 cents, a nickel. and he offered it as his contribution. No matter how urgent or desperate the appeal was, it could be for helping a needy bride to get married, pidyon shvuim, saving a Jew who was sent to prison for an unpaid debt, or helping a storekeeper burnt down. Didn't matter. Out of the purse came the 5 kopecks. And people became so disgusted that here was such a wealthy man and all he gave them was this rusty coin. Whenever he gave it to them, they'd throw it back in his face. It had no effect on the miser, and people stopped coming to him altogether. And a story would happen. There was a young couple. There were 2 poor orphans getting ready to marry. They were penniless, and the whole town took it upon themselves to provide them with their needs, an outfit of clothes for the bride and for the groom, pots, pans, cutlery, everything they needed. And they also made sure there would be a beautiful feast, a simcha, which everyone could enjoy. And everyone had contributed in that town to this special fund and felt they were entitled to participate. There was one exception, this rich miser. Nobody even went to him for contribution. And in any case, his 5 kopkes would make no difference. In the middle of all these happy preparations for the wedding, a terrible calamity suddenly crashed down, and it changed their gladness to sadness. Without any warning, the groom was taken into custody by the chief of police for military service. You see, at that time, Alexander I was Tsar of Russia, and the Jews were subjected to military service. And they could be excused if they paid a very big ransom. Now, going to the Russian army meant there was harassment, no kosher food, pressures to convert, and nobody wanted to go into active service. They'd rather pay the tax. This chief of police was new at his job, but he was a terrible anti-Semite. And when he heard that there's a wedding to take place, he thought, this is my opportunity to strike them all. He sent his soldiers to take the groom into custody for military service on his wedding day. A special delegation hurried to the chief of police. They wanted to arrange for the release of this chosen against the payment of tax, plus a handsome gift to expedite his release so that the wedding plans would not be postponed. The chief drove them out. He said he would send them all to Siberia if they continued harassing them. They didn't know what to do. Baruch Hashem, at this critical time, a most distinguished visitor had arrived in town, the famous Rabbi Shneur Zalman of Liadi, the Alter Rebbe. It appeared that he was the one who was behind the shidduch between these 2 orphans, and he came to join them in marriage and rejoice with them. But he didn't find the town in simcha. He found the bride and all the townspeople in a state of shock and confusion. When the Alter Rebbe heard this story, he asked the rabbi of the town to accompany him to the chief of the police. The chief met them with open hostility and was going to break into his usual cursing of Jews. A piercing look of the Alter Rebbe left him stunned and speechless. He recovered a few moments later with a different respect, and he asked the visitors, "What did you come for?" And they said, "We've come to ask you to release the chosen, the bridegroom, who is to be married tonight. He is not suited to be a soldier in the Tsar's army, and we are ready to pay the tax to obtain his immediate release. Just name the amount," said the Alter Rebbe in a firm voice. Now, it so happened that this police chief was an avid card player. He was a habitual gambler, and he saw himself in terrible, serious debt. He saw a chance to get a large amount of money from the Jews. He said the amount is 1,000 rubles. 1,000 rubles was an enormous amount of money in those days. Without hesitation, the Alter Rebbe said, "You will get that amount before sunset." As they go outside, the rabbi asked the Rebbe, "How can we possibly raise such a large sum of money from our poor townspeople and before sunset today? And they've already given so much money for all the wedding and their needs. They don't have any more." The Alter Rebbe answered, "The Almighty, the Father of orphans, will not fail them. Let's make a list of donors." So when they reached the rabbi's house, they sat down, and the rabbi made a list of the people he knew and the amount that could be expected realistically from each and every one of them. Sadly, the total amount that the rabbi believed he could collect was barely 100 rubles. He handed the list to the Rebbe. The Rebbe took one look at it, and he said, "I see you didn't include the name of that rich man in town." "Ach," said the rabbi, "it would be a waste of time to go to him. What do you think? 5 kopkes could help?" "Nevertheless," said the Alter Rebbe, "we will go to him and give him the opportunity to do the great mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuyim." And he handed the list back to the rabbi, and the rabbi took his pen and was about to add the man to the bottom of the list. And the Rebbe said, "No, no, no. Put this man to the top of the list. We're going to him first." The rich mice had been standing at the window when he saw the rabbi and the Rebbe approaching his house. He went out to meet them and invited them in. The Alter Rebbe told this rich man what had happened to the chassan, to the groom, and they were now trying to raise money to get him free so that he could get married that night as planned. Rich man didn't answer anything. He took out his purse, took out a rusty 5 kopke coin, and offered it to the rabbi. Before the rabbi had a chance to say or do anything, the Alter Rebbe quickly took the coin and said to the donor, "May you have the schus to do many more mitzvahs." As they got up to leave, the Jew suddenly said, "I think my contribution was maybe too small. Here's a whole ruble." The Alter Rebbe took the ruble and again repeated his blessing. "Thank you so much. May God help you to do many more mitzvahs." As they turned towards the door, the Jew called out, he says, "Excuse me, Rebbe, I'd like to give you a bigger donation." He took out a 10 ruble banknote, handed it to the Alter Rebbe, and again, the Alter Rebbe took it gratefully and blessed him continuously. Turned to leave, and the performance continued many, many times. Each time, the rich man increasing his donation and the Rebbe accepting it graciously and blessing him. Finally, the Jew broke down and burst into tears. The Alter Rebbe said nothing and waited for the man to compose himself. After wiping the tears off his face, the rich man said to the Alter Rebbe, "I once gave a beggar a 5 kopke coin that was all I had on me. He threw it back in my face. I was so annoyed I said to myself, this copper coin is going to be my donation, whatever the cause might be. Whoever solicits my contribution, that's what he's going to get, until someone finally accepts it with a friendly word. Since then, that 5 copper coin was always returned to me with scorn and abuse, until people stopped coming to me altogether for charity. You, my saintly Rebbe, is the first person who accepted my 5 copper coin with friendliness. You gave me the opportunity to participate in the mitzvah of Pidyon Shvuim. You even found it in your heart to bless me with the merit of doing more mitzvahs. You have changed me into a different person. I will never forget what you did for me. And now I want to give you the full amount needed to pay for the groom's release. And I tell you, I give it with all my heart, and I hope and pray that somehow it can make up for all the tzedakah opportunities which I have missed. The Alter Rebbe blessed him again, that Hashem should enable him to give tzedakah with an open hand and a joyous heart. And accompanied by the rabbi, they hurried to keep the appointment with the chief of police. The chief of police was overjoyed with his newfound wealth and brought out the groom. The Alter Rebbe, the rabbi, the groom were all beaming with joy, and they set off immediately for the wedding hall. The wedding was celebrated with unsurpassed joy and gratitude. One of the most distinguished guests, in addition, of course, to the Alter Rebbe, was the hero of this occasion, the Jew who had donated the whole ransom money for the groom's release. As the news of his generosity became known to all the townspeople, the person who had been an outcast now became a respected and beloved member of the community. The dancing, the singing celebration lasted well into the night. And as it was about to come to an end, news came in that this anti-Semitic police chief, who had done so much harm to all the Jews of a city, was in a terrible accident. And he died while crossing the bridge. His horse had slipped and thrown him to his death. Early the next morning, the chassan, the groom, went to the river to bathe. And near the bridge, he found a leather purse with 1,000 rubles in it. He took it to the rabbi to ask what to do with it. And the rabbi said, Hashgacha pratis, God's ways are great. This is the money which the chief at police had extorted from us as the price of your freedom, and he left no heir. It is yours. Consider it as a wedding gift from Hashem the Almighty, and use it in good health and happiness. This story of the Alter Rebbe teaches us so much. Number one, how he was a man of peace and friendliness to everyone, even to his biggest opposition. You see from his letters how much he promotes the mitzvah of tzedakah, and how he says that it is the mitzvah of tzedakah today, which is the mitzvah of all. We all know that at this time of the year it says, Utshuva, utfila, utzedakah ma'avirin asagraya gzeira, that it is the shuva, repentance, the prayer, and especially the tzedakah, which is the most important mitzvah of all, we are told, in the final hours of Golus, to be redeemed. Tzien b'mishpat tipade v'shaver b'tzedakah, we will truly be released from through tzedakah. Let us take the Alter Rebbe's teachings, his inspiration, his lessons, increase in tzedakah, do what it takes, and above all, as Rabbi Masinta has started a new Tanya whole teaching, let us learn his lessons to heart, and through the merit of him and his teachings and us taking them up, may we be privileged. This is the last Mitzvah Shabbos of the year. Next Shabbos is Rosh Hashanah. We won't have a shir, obviously. Next Mitzvah Shabbos, let us go to the new year with gesund, with blessing, with freedom to practice Torah mitzvahs the way it was before the COVID, and even better, take the changes it did for us. And as we go to Slichus tonight, ask God to bench us with a year of gesund, mazel, bracha, nachas, parnasa, and redemption. Thank you.
Rabbi Kalabach, to you, thank you for sharing with us week after week the most amazing insights and stories. The story with the Alter Rebbe and the 5 Kopics is absolutely unbelievable. And please God, you and your family should be blessed with the Ksivach Simateva and everybody else. We'll see